The orbital station, called Crucible Prime, hung in the darkness between two dead stars, like a metal fist waiting to strike something. Inside its gray walls and humming corridors walked 200 trainees from 90 different species, and every single one of them believed they were the toughest creature in the galaxy. Every single one of them was wrong. The Galactic Military Academy had been grinding soldiers into shape for 300 years, and it had never once gone easy on anyone who walked through its doors. The current cohort had survived 14 months of brutal training, and they were about to face the one test that none of them were ready for. But we will get to that. First, we need to talk about the human. Sergeant Kai Nakamura stood 5 feet 10 inches tall and weighed about 170 pounds, and by every physical measure in the Academy records, he was one of the least impressive trainees in the entire cohort. Felinari were faster than him with their powerful feline legs that could launch them across a room in half a heartbeat. The Goravan were stronger than him, with stone-like skin and arms thick as tree trunks that could bend metal beams without effort. The Velthron were more precise than him, with 4 arms that could operate weapons and tools simultaneously with mechanical accuracy. The Shalavrai were more armored than him, with reptilian scales that could stop a blade and claws that could tear through hull plating. Kai had none of these advantages. What Kai had was a smile that made other species uncomfortable, because they could never figure out what it meant. He had ranked in the middle of the cohort for 14 months straight, and he had done this so consistently that it almost looked intentional. Nobody paid him much attention, and that was exactly how he wanted it. Rael Tanvari paid him attention, though, and not the kind anyone would want. Rael was a Felinari warrior with golden fur and amber eyes, and muscles that rippled under his coat like coiled springs ready to snap. He was the top-ranked trainee in the cohort, and he had made it very clear from the first week that he considered the human to be a waste of space. "You do not belong here, persistence pest," Rael had told Kai on the 3rd day of training while towering over him in the mess hall with his ears flat against his skull. "Your species crawled out of the mud 5 minutes ago, and now you think you can stand beside real warriors?" Kai had looked up at the massive feline and smiled that strange smile, and said, "You are probably right," and then gone back to eating his food. This had made Rael angrier than any insult could have, because Kai never fought back, and Kai never rose to the bait, and Kai never seemed to care what anyone thought of him, and that was deeply unsettling to a species that lived and breathed dominance. Hierarchies. What Rael did not notice, and what almost nobody noticed, was what Kai did when nobody was watching. Every night, after the training day ended, and the other trainees went to their quarters to rest and recover, Kai went down to the lower decks alone. He ran environmental simulations that nobody else touched because they were classified as recreational, and therefore pointless. He studied the combat styles and movement patterns of every species in the cohort, making quiet notes on a datapad he kept under his mattress. He watched, and he listened, and he learned, and he filed everything away in that strange, soft-skinned skull of his. The one person who noticed was Zeke. Zeke was a Gorvan, which meant he stood 7 feet tall and weighed over 400 pounds, and had skin the color and texture of gray granite. He was the strongest trainee in the cohort by a wide margin, and also the gentlest. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his voice cracks sounded like 2 boulders grinding together in a way that was somehow kind. One night he found Kai in the lower deck, running a simulation of a volcanic environment at maximum difficulty, and he stood in the doorway and watched the small human navigate the hellscape with calm, efficient movements. "You train more than the others know," Zeke had said. "I like to stay busy," Kai had replied, without stopping. "You are not training your body," Zeke said. "You are training something else." Kai had paused then, and looked at the massive stone-skinned alien, and for just a moment the smile was gone, and something sharper was behind his eyes. I am training my mind to never be surprised, Kai said. After that they were friends, in the quiet way that two very different creatures can be friends when they recognize something real in each other. 14 months passed, and the cohort shrank from 230 to 200 as the weakest were washed out. The rest were hardened into something approaching soldiers. And then Commandant Vorel Thax made the announcement that changed everything. Thax was a Shalavri, and he was enormous, even by the standards of his reptilian species. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, with scales the color of dark iron, and eyes like molten copper. He had run the academy for 40 years, and he had never once smiled at a trainee. He stood before the assembled cohort in the central amphitheater, and his voice filled the room like thunder rolling across a plain. "You have trained for 14 months, and you believe you are ready," he said. "You are not ready, but the schedule does not care what I believe, so we move forward." He activated the holographic display behind him, and the room filled with the image of a planet. A planet covered in green and blue and brown and white, with swirling clouds and vast oceans. It looked almost beautiful, until you read the environmental data. Scrolling alongside it. "The final evaluation is the Deathworld simulation," Thax said. 72 hours in a holographically generated environment, based on a real Deathworld in the Galactic catalog. "You do not need to win," he continued. "You do not need to fight anything or complete any objective other than one single task, and that task is to survive for 72 hours. He let that sink in. In 300 years of this academy, the average elimination rate for this test is 84%, and the best cohort in our history still lost 62% of its trainees. The room was very quiet. "The simulation adapts," Thax said, and his copper eyes swept the room. "It learns from your strategies, and it escalates its threats accordingly, and it does not stop." Kai sat in the back row, and he was not looking at the commandant. He was looking at the planet on the display. Something about the blue and green marble was very familiar to him. After the briefing, he found a technician in the simulation wing and asked one simple question. "What world is the simulation based on this year?" The technician pulled up the file, and the color drained from her face, which was impressive, given that her species was naturally pale blue. "It is based on Deathworld 7 in the Galactic catalog," she said. "The native species calls it Earth." Kai Nakamura looked at the file, and he looked at the environmental parameters, and he looked at the list of simulated threats that included everything from venomous snakes to superstorms, to pack-hunting predators, to waterborne parasites, to seismic events. And he smiled. Not the polite smile he wore for the other trainees, and not the empty smile he gave to Rael when the Felinari tried to provoke him. This was a different smile entirely. This was the smile of a man who had just been told that the most feared test in the galaxy was based on his backyard. He closed the file and walked away whistling a tune the technician did not recognize. It was an old song from a place called Earth, a place that had been trying to kill his species for 200,000 years, a place that had never once succeeded. The simulation pods were cold and dark, and they smelled like recycled air and fear. 200 trainees climbed into their individual pods, and the lids sealed shut with a hiss that sounded far too much like a coffin closing for comfort. The world that opened around them was beautiful, in the way that a predator is beautiful, right before it kills you. Green forests stretched in every direction, under a sky that burned a shade of blue most species had never seen before. Because most species came from worlds with different atmospheric compositions. The gravity hit them first. 1.1 times standard, which did not sound like much until you realized that most of the trainees came from worlds with gravity between 0.6 and 0.9 standard. For the Gorvon, it was manageable. For the light-boned Veltran, it was like carrying an invisible weight on every limb that never went away. For the methane-breathing Crothy, it was the least of their worries. Problems because the air itself was trying to kill them. 21% oxygen. On most civilized worlds, the oxygen content sat between 8 and 14%, because anything higher was considered dangerously reactive. Earth apparently had not received that memo. The temperature in the starting zone was 32 degrees, and the humidity was so thick that Rael Tanvari felt like he was breathing through a wet blanket. His golden fur was already matting against his skin within the first hour, and his body temperature was climbing because Felinari were built for dry savannas, not tropical swamps. But the environment was just the opening act. The simulation had so much more to offer. By hour 6, the first wave of eliminations had swept through the cohort like a scythe. 3 Felinari went down when a flash flood roared through a river valley without any warning at all, because on Earth, the weather did not politely announce its intentions. A dozen trainees from low-gravity worlds simply collapsed because their bodies could not sustain the effort of moving through heavy air and heavy gravity at the same time. 2 Crothii were eliminated when the oxygen content caused chemical burns inside their respiratory systems, and the simulation medics pulled them out before real damage could be done. 40 trainees gone in 6 hours. The simulation was just warming up. By hour 18, the number had climbed to 90, and the reasons for elimination were getting creative. A pack of simulated wolves had cornered a squad of 8 trainees in a ravine and torn through them with coordinated precision that shocked species who had never encountered pack hunters that worked together like a single mind. Venomous snakes struck from hidden positions in the undergrowth, and their neurotoxins shut down nervous systems in minutes. Insects swarmed in clouds so thick they blocked out the light, and the bites carried diseases that the trainees had no immunity against. Rael was struggling badly now, and he knew it, and the knowledge burned worse than the heat. His fur was soaked, and his body temperature was dangerously high, and every step felt like pushing through invisible mud. He had killed 2 of the wolves with his bare claws, because Felinari were still apex predators, even on a Deathworld, but the effort had cost him energy he could not afford to spend. Jeek was faring better, because Gorvon were heavy worlders, built for punishment, but even his stone skin was showing hairline cracks from the thermal stress of temperature swings that ranged from freezing nights to scorching days. A simulated snake bit him during a river crossing, and the neurotoxin began spreading up his arm like fire under his skin. He would have been eliminated right there if he had not remembered something Kai had told him 3 weeks ago in the mess hall during what seemed like casual conversation. If you ever get bitten by something venomous and you cannot get the venom out, Kai had said, between bites of food, as if he were discussing the weather, heat a rock in a fire and press it against the wound, because the heat breaks down the protein structure of most venoms. At the time, Jeek had thought it was strange and random advice. Now he built a fire and heated a rock and burned the venom out of his own arm, and he screamed while he did it, but he survived. He would remember later that Kai had given him that advice, as if he had known somehow that it would be needed. By hour 30, the cohort was cut in half, and the simulation was adapting just as Thax had promised. The predators were no longer random encounters. They were coordinated attacks, with multiple species working together in ways that should not have been possible, but the simulation did not care about what should be possible. A disease outbreak swept through the southern zone and eliminated 12 trainees in a single hour as their immune systems encountered pathogens they had no defense against. The trainees who had grouped together for safety began turning on each other as supplies ran low, and fear replaced discipline. By hour 48, only 22 trainees remained, and the simulation introduced its final phase, the apex predator. It was a nightmare given digital flesh. The simulation had combined the traits of Earth's most lethal animals into a single creature that moved like liquid shadow through the undergrowth. It had the strength of a bear, and the speed of a cheetah, and the cunning of a wolf, and the patience of a crocodile. And it hunted the remaining trainees with a cold intelligence that made even the bravest of them feel like prey. And through all of this, nobody had thought about the human, because the human had been eliminated at hour 12. Trainee 0117 Kai Nakamura had flatlined during a river crossing in the northern zone. Hypothermia, combined with a parasitic infection, had shut down his vital signs, and the simulation had marked him as eliminated and moved on to more interesting targets. That was what the record showed. The record was wrong. What actually happened was something that would not be discovered until much later, and it would change how the entire galaxy thought about the species called human. Kai had entered the river crossing knowing exactly what would happen, because he had studied the simulation's biometric monitoring systems during his months of late-night research. He knew that the simulation tracked heart rate and body temperature and neural activity to determine if a trainee was still active. And he knew something that no other species in the cohort could do. He could lower his own heart rate to near-death levels using a breathing technique that humans had developed thousands of years ago on Earth, for reasons that ranged from spiritual practice to survival in freezing water. He dropped into the river, and he slowed his heart, and he let his body temperature fall, and the simulation looked at his numbers and decided he was dead. And then it forgot about him. For 6 hours, Kai lay in the riverbed, barely breathing and perfectly still, and the simulation's adaptive AI moved on to hunting the remaining trainees. When he was certain the system had written him off completely, he opened his eyes and stood up and walked out of the river like a ghost rising from its own grave. And then he went to work. For the next 48 hours, while the simulation hunted and killed every other trainee, Kai moved through the environment like he owned it. He was not trying to survive. He was studying. He tracked the simulation's predator spawning patterns and mapped the timing of weather events and cataloged every adaptive escalation the AI deployed against the other trainees. He raided the supply caches of eliminated trainees and stockpiled food and tools in a cave system he had identified on the first day. He built shelter, and he made fire, and he purified water, and he hunted small game, and he did all of it without the simulation knowing he was alive. He was a dead man walking through a world that had been designed to kill everything, and he was taking notes. At hour 72, the simulation ended, and the alarms blared, and every single trainee was listed as eliminated. Every single one. In the monitoring room, Commandant Thax stared at the board showing 200 names, all marked in red, and he felt something he had not felt in 40 years of running the academy. He felt unsettled. A total wipe. It had only happened 4 times in 300 years. And then a technician spoke up with a voice that was shaking slightly. "Sir, Trainee 0117. The human, his pod, is still active, and his vitals are normal, and the system shows him as eliminated, but he is still interacting with the environment." Thax turned to the monitoring feed and saw something that would keep him awake for many nights to come. Kai Nakamura was sitting inside a shelter he had built from wood and leaves near a small fire, with cooked meat on a stick, looking directly at the point where a hidden monitoring camera was positioned. He was smiling, and somehow, impossibly, the dead man was waving. The amphitheater smelled like antiseptic and wounded pride. 200 trainees sat in the curved rows of seating, and most of them were wrapped in medical bandages or nursing injuries that the simulation had inflicted on their real bodies through the neural feedback system. Broken bones had been set, and burns had been treated, and venom damage had been flushed from bloodstreams. But the deeper wounds were the ones that no medical team could fix. These were soldiers who had been told their entire lives that they were the best their species had to offer, and they had all failed. Rael Tonvari sat in the third row, with his golden fur still patchy from the heat damage, and his amber eyes staring at the floor, because looking at anyone else meant seeing his own failure reflected back at him. He had gone down at hour 71 and 43 minutes, which meant he had been 17 minutes away from surviving. And that was the kind of near miss that would eat. A Felinari, alive for years. Zeke sat near the back, with his stone skin still showing cracks that would take weeks to heal, and his massive hands folded in his lap, with a patience that came from being a species that measured time in centuries. He was not ashamed of his failure, because Gorvan did not process emotion that way, but he was thinking about something, and the something was the human who had taught him to burn venom out of his own flesh. Commandant Thax stood at the front of the amphitheater, and he looked at the cohort with his copper eyes, and he did not soften his words, because that was not his way, and these were not children. Say, total elimination, he said, and the words fell on the room like stones dropping into still water. Every trainee in this cohort was removed from the simulation before the 72-hour mark was reached. He paused and let the silence do its work. This is the 5th total wipe in the history of this academy, and I will not pretend it is anything other than what it is, which is a failure. No one moved. However, tradition allows for a remedial path, and you will be given the opportunity to retake a modified evaluation in 60 days, and those of you who pass will graduate with a notation on your records. A notation that every military recruiter in the galaxy would read as, "They could not handle the real test." But Thax did not say that part out loud, because he did not need to. He was about to dismiss the assembly when a movement in the back row caught his eye. Someone was standing up. It was the human Kai Nakamura, rose from his seat, and every head in the amphitheater turned to look at him, because most of them had forgotten he existed, and the ones who remembered him thought he had been eliminated in the first day. What they saw confused them. Every other trainee in the room was damaged in some visible way, bandages and bruises and limps and the hollow look in the eyes that comes from being hunted for 3 days straight. Kai looked like he had just come back from a vacation. He was clean and rested, and his uniform was pressed, and there was not a single mark on him. He stood straight, and he addressed the commandant with a voice that was calm and clear, and carried to every corner of the room without effort. "Commandant Thax, I respectfully decline the remedial path." The room stirred. Thax raised one scaled brow ridge, which was the Shalavri equivalent of extreme surprise. "You decline?" "Yes, sir," Kai said. "Instead, I am formally requesting permission to re-enter the Deathworld simulation for a second full 72-hour cycle at the difficulty level where it ended." The silence that followed was so complete that you could hear the station's life support systems humming in the walls. Then Rael shot to his feet, with his ears flat and his fangs showing. "This is a joke," he snarled. "Eliminated at hour 24, like the rest of us, and now you stand there and pretend you deserve a second chance at glory." "Trainee Tonvari, sit down," Thax said without looking at him, and Rael sat, because when a Shalavri commandant tells you to sit, you sit. Thax turned to the technical staff at the monitoring stations. "Explain the anomaly with Trainee 0117. The lead technician was a Velthran with 4 hands, all of which were fidgeting nervously as she pulled up the data on the main display for everyone to see. At hour 24, Trainee Nakamura's biometric readings indicated complete systemic failure during a river crossing, she said. The simulation classified him as eliminated, but his pod remained active because his body continued to interact with the environment. She paused and looked at her data again as if hoping it might change. "Our analysis indicates that Trainee Nakamura deliberately suppressed his own vital signs to a level that mimicked death, and the simulation's monitoring system accepted this as a genuine elimination." Another pause. He then resumed full activity and spent the remaining 48 hours moving freely through the environment, without the simulation's adaptive AI recognizing him as a living target. The amphitheater erupted. 200 voices from 90 species, all talking at once, and the sound was like a zoo having an argument with itself. Thax silenced them with a single word in his command voice that resonated at a frequency most species found physically impossible to ignore. Quiet. Quiet happened. Thax looked at Kai with an expression that was impossible to read, because Shalavri faces were not designed for the kind of emotion he was currently feeling. "You faked your own death inside the simulation," he said. "Yes, sir. And then you spent 48 hours doing what exactly?" This was the moment that Kai had been waiting for, and he delivered it without any trace of arrogance or showmanship, because what he was about to say did not need decoration. "I spent 48 hours studying the simulation's adaptive AI," he said. "I mapped its threat escalation patterns and its predator deployment logic, and its environmental hazard timing, and I identified the decision trees it uses to select and intensify dangers." He took a breath. "I understand how it thinks now, sir," he said. Another silence, but this one had a different quality to it, like the air before a storm. "And you want to go back in?" Thax said. "Yes, sir. But not to survive," Kai said. "I survived the first time, and that was the easy part." He looked directly at the Commandant, and the smile was gone, and his eyes were steady and serious, and something in them made Thax think of the old war stories about species that fought, not because they could win, but because they did not know how to stop. Kai said. "I want to push the simulation past its maximum escalation curve until it runs out of ways to try to kill me. I want to beat it." The amphitheater was silent again, but now the silence was filled with something electric and uncertain, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Thax studied the human for a long time. Part of him wanted to deny the request because it was unprecedented, and because the simulation at maximum difficulty had a theoretical lethality rating that no living creature should be able to withstand. But another part of him, the part that had been a soldier before he was a commandant, wanted to see what would happen. And if he was being honest with himself, which he always was, a small part of him wanted to watch the human fail spectacularly so that he could close the file on humanity's admission to the Concordance with a clear conscience. "Granted," Thax said, "you will enter the simulation tomorrow at 0600, and the AI will begin at the maximum difficulty level it reached during the first evaluation, and you will have 72 hours. He leaned forward slightly. "And Trainee Nakamura, understand that the simulation will know you are alive this time, and it will be ready for you." Kai nodded. "Good," he said. "Then I will not have to wait for it to get interesting." He sat down, and the assembly was dismissed, and 200 trainees filed out of the amphitheater in stunned silence. In the corridor outside, drill instructor Kesari intercepted Kai with her forearms crossed and her compound eyes fixed on him with the intensity of a species that did not blink. "This is suicide," she said flatly. "The simulation at maximum adaptive difficulty is a theoretical kill box, and no trainee in 300 years has ever." "I know," Kai said. "Then why?" Kai looked at her, and for just a moment the mask slipped, and she saw something underneath that she would later describe in her personal log as the most terrifying thing I have ever seen in a soft-bodied organism. It was certainty. Not confidence, which is loud and brittle, but certainty, which is quiet and unbreakable. "Because where I come from," Kai said, "we do not believe in unwinnable scenarios, and we have 200,000 years of evidence to prove it." He walked away, and Kesari watched him go, and she felt something she had not felt since she was a larva, which was the sudden cold understanding that she was looking at something she did not fully comprehend. Near the pod bay, Jaik was waiting. The massive Gorvan did not try to talk Kai out of it, because he had learned over the past months that trying to talk a human out of something was like trying to talk a river into flowing uphill. Instead, he said the truest thing he could think of. When this is over, I would like to understand how your species thinks, because it is not like anything I have encountered in my life. Kai reached up and clapped the giant on his stone shoulder and grinned. We are just stubborn, big guy. Zeke shook his head slowly. No, he said. Stubborn is what the Felinari are, when they refuse to lose a dominance challenge. And stubborn is what my people are, when we refuse to move from a position we have held for generations. He looked down at the small human with something that might have been wonder. What you are is something else entirely, and I do not think your language has a word for it. Kai thought about that for a moment. Actually, we do, he said. We call it human. And then he walked into the pod bay to prepare for tomorrow. Because tomorrow, the most dangerous test in the galaxy, was going to learn what Earth had known for 200,000 years. That the scariest thing in the universe is not the thing that is trying to kill you. It is the thing that keeps getting back up after you. Thought you already did. The monitoring room was standing room only, and that had never happened before in the history of the Academy. Word had spread through Crucible Prime like fire through dry grass. And by the time Kai stepped into his simulation pod at 0600, there were over 300 observers packed into a room designed for 40. Commandant Thax sat in his command chair, with his iron-colored scales catching the blue light of the monitoring screens. Drill Instructor Kesari stood behind him, with all four arms clasped behind her back, and her compound eyes locked on the main display. 3 visiting admirals from the Concordance Defense Fleet had arrived overnight after receiving an urgent communication from someone on Thax's staff, and they sat in the observation gallery with expressions that ranged from skeptical to openly amused. In the back row of the gallery, pressed against the wall, stood Zeke, and beside him, with his golden fur freshly groomed and his amber eyes burning with something complicated, stood Rael Tonvari. Neither of them spoke. On the main display, the simulation loaded its environment, and the data readouts filled the screen with numbers that made several of the technicians physically uncomfortable. Maximum adaptive difficulty from the first second. Gravity locked at 1.1 standard. Full spectrum of environmental hazards active immediately. Apex predator protocols engaged from hour 0. The simulation was not going to waste time building up to the hard part. It was going to try to kill Kai Nakamura as fast and as brutally as it could. The pod sealed, and the countdown began, and then the world opened up around Kai like a mouth. He dropped into hell. The simulation threw everything at him in the first 60 seconds. A Category 5 storm materialized overhead, with winds that could pick up a Felinari and throw them like a toy. The ground split open beneath his feet as seismic charges rippled through the terrain. Toxic gas vented from fissures in the rock, and the air turned yellow and poisonous. And through the chaos, moving like a shadow made of teeth and hunger, the apex predator emerged from the tree line, already locked onto his position. In the monitoring room, one of the admirals leaned forward and muttered, "He is dead already." Kai did not run. He did not hide. He did not panic. He reached down and grabbed a handful of mud and ash from the ground near a gas vent and smeared it across his face and arms and torso. Then he grabbed a burning branch from a tree that had been struck by lightning, and he ran straight at the apex predator. Not away from it, at it. The creature hesitated for exactly 1.3 seconds, because every prey animal in its behavioral programming was supposed to run away, and this one was charging forward, screaming and waving fire. Seconds. Kai changed direction and sprinted into the tree line and disappeared. The monitoring room went silent. "What is he doing?" one of the admirals asked. Kesari answered without taking her eyes off the screen. "He is using the storm as cover, and the mud as thermal camouflage, and the fire as a deterrent. and he is moving toward high ground. She paused. He planned this before he entered the pod. In the simulation, Kai moved through the burning forest with a speed and purpose that looked nothing like survival and everything like execution of a strategy. He was not reacting to the simulation. He was ahead of it. By hour 4, he had reached the cave system. The same cave system he had found during round 1 when he was supposed to be dead. And inside the cave, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural but was not, he found the supplies he had cached during those 48 hours of ghost-walking through the first simulation. PP. Food and water and sharpened sticks and braided vine rope and a collection of stones selected for their shape and weight. He had prepared for round 2 before round 2 was even approved. In the monitoring room, Thax stood up slowly from his chair. He cached supplies during the first run, the Commandant said, and his voice was very quiet. While we thought he was eliminated, he was preparing for this moment. That is impossible, one of the admirals said. He could not have known he would be allowed back in. Thax looked at the admiral with his copper eyes and said nothing, because the truth was written on every screen in the room. The human had not hoped he would be allowed back in. He had decided he would be, and he had prepared accordingly. Hours 5 through 8 were a masterclass in something that no species in the Concordance had a proper word for, because no other species had needed to invent it. Bushcraft. Kai used fire to create a controlled burn zone around his base camp, which eliminated every plant-based threat in a 200-meter radius, and forced the simulation's predator AI to reroute, because the animals would not cross a field of hot ash. He built an elevated sleeping platform using techniques that humans had developed in the rainforests of Southeast Asia thousands of years ago, where sleeping on the ground meant waking up dead from snake bites, or insect swarms, or flooding. He constructed a water purification system using charcoal and sand and cloth that removed pathogens and parasites from the stream near his cave. These were not advanced technologies. These were solutions that predated human civilization itself, passed down through generations of people who lived on a world that wanted them dead and who refused to die. The simulation responded by escalating. Earthquakes at hour 9, designed to collapse his cave system, already reinforced the entrance with a timber frame braced against the load-bearing rock, because humans had been building mine supports for thousands of years. Flash floods at hour 12, designed to wash away his camp. He had built on high ground, with drainage channels cut into the earth, because humans had been managing water flow since before they had writing. New predator spawns at hour 15, with bigger, faster, more aggressive creatures designed to overwhelm his defenses. And this was where the monitoring room fell truly silent, because Kai did not defend against the new predators. He hunted them. He built deadfall traps using heavy logs balanced on trigger sticks, and he baited them with meat from his cached supplies. He dug pit traps lined with sharpened stakes and covered with thin branches and leaves. He constructed a throwing spear with a fire-hardened tip, and he used thermal camouflage of mud and ash to mask his heat signature. He stalked the apex predator through the undergrowth with the patience of something that had been hunting for 200,000 years. He killed the apex predator at hour 20 with a spear through its throat from a concealed position above a game trail. The simulation spawned 2 more. He killed those as well. By hour 25 he had a collection of hides drying near his fire, and a rack of smoked meat, and a perimeter of traps that turned his camp into a kill zone for anything that entered it. Kesari turned to Thax and whispered, "The simulation is supposed to be the predator, sir, but he has reversed the equation." Thax said nothing. He was watching the human on the screen, and he was feeling something that he would not admit to anyone, which was fear. Not fear of Kai Nakamura, the individual. Fear of what Kai Nakamura represented. A species that did not just survive hostile environments, but colonized them, and mastered them. Made them home. At hour 36, the simulation reached its maximum escalation tier. which was a scenario that had been designed by the Academy's best minds to be theoretically unsurvivable. Everything happened at once. A superstorm combined with volcanic activity, combined with coordinated predator swarms, combined with airborne disease vectors, combined with gravitational fluctuations that made movement nearly impossible. It was an extinction-level event, compressed into a single simulated space. Kai retreated to his cave and sealed the entrance with rocks and timber, and he sat by his fire with his water supply and his smoked meat, and he waited. He waited the way his ancestors had waited out ice ages and volcanic winters and plagues that killed half their population. Stubbornly, patiently, with absolute certainty that the storm would end and he would still be there when it did. At hour 50, the extinction event subsided and the simulation tried to escalate again. And something happened that the technicians had never seen before. The adaptive AI cycled through its threat database and selected a combination and deployed it. And then it selected the same combination 12 hours later, because it had run out of new options. The simulation was repeating itself. "That should not be possible," the lead technician said with all four hands frozen over her console. "The threat library contains over 9,000 unique combinations. He has countered or survived every single one," Kesari said, and there was something in her voice that might have been awe. At hour 60, Kai emerged from the cave and walked through the Deathworld environment the way a person walks through their own garden. He checked his traps and collected 2 kills and reset the mechanisms. He gathered materials and reinforced his shelter. He tended his fire and cooked a meal. New tools from bone and stone and wood. He was not surviving. He was living. The simulation continued to throw threats at him, but they were echoes now, and repetitions of things he had already beaten, and he dealt with them the way a person deals with a familiar inconvenience, which is to say with mild annoyance and efficient action. In the final hour, something happened that made Commandant Voral Thax, who had commanded armies and survived 3 wars and never shown surprise in 40 years of service, stand up from his chair. Kai found the highest point on the simulation map, which was a rocky peak overlooking a valley of green and gold. He climbed it slowly, because there was no rush. He sat down on the edge with his legs dangling over the void, and he watched the sunrise that the simulation had generated as part of its environmental cycle. The light painted the Deathworld in shades of orange and red and gold, and the human sat there in the middle of a world designed to kill everything that moved, and he looked completely and utterly at peace. He looked like he was home. The timer on the monitoring screen counted down the final seconds. 72 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds. Simulation complete. Trainee 0117 active. The room erupted, but Thax did not hear any of it, because he was still watching the screen, where the human sat on a mountaintop, on a simulated world that had thrown everything it had at him. And the human was watching the sunrise, and the human was smiling. And for the first time in his life, Commandant Vorel Thax understood why the Galactic Classification Board had put a warning label on that little blue and green planet at the edge of the spiral arm. Not because of the volcanoes, or the predators, or the diseases, or the storms. Because of the people. Because the people were worse than all of it combined. The Grand Hall of Crucible Prime had not been filled to capacity in over a decade. It was filled now. Ambassadors from 30 species sat in the upper gallery in their formal dress, which ranged from living crystal armor to woven light garments to simple gray robes, depending on the culture. Admirals from the Concordance Defense Fleet occupied the front rows, and their chests were heavy with medals earned in wars that had shaped the borders of civilized space. Behind them sat the instructors and the staff and the support personnel who kept the academy running, and who had all found excuses to be present for this particular ceremony. And in the center section, 200 trainees sat in their dress uniforms, and every one of them was looking at the small human standing alone at the front of the hall. Kai Nakamura wore the same uniform as everyone else, but somehow, on him, it looked different. Not because it fit better, or because he wore it with more pride, but because every person in that room now knew what was underneath the uniform and the skin and the quiet smile. Something that did not stop. Commandant Thax stood at the ceremonial podium, and his iron scales gleamed under the lights, and his copper eyes swept the assembly with the gravity of a man about to do something that had only been done 9 times in 3 centuries. "The Crucible Mark," he said, and his voice filled the hall like a bell being struck, "is the highest honor this academy can bestow upon a trainee. It is given not for excellence in combat, or for mastery of tactics, or for physical superiority, although past recipients have demonstrated all of these qualities. It is given for something rarer." He paused. "It is given for the demonstration of a spirit that this academy was built to find, and that the Concordance Defense Fleet was built to wield." He turned to face Kai directly. "Trainee Nakamura, you are the first being in the history of this institution to complete the Deathworld simulation solo at maximum adaptive difficulty, and you are the first to exhaust the simulation's threat capacity entirely. The Crucible Mark is yours." The hall erupted in the sounds that different species made when they wanted to express respect and admiration, which ranged from deep rumbling to high-pitched clicking to rhythmic stamping to absolute silence, depending on the culture. Thax placed the mark on Kai's collar. It was a small thing made of dark metal, shaped like a flame inside a circle, and it weighed almost nothing. But what it represented was heavier than most beings could carry. Then Thax stepped aside and offered Kai the podium, because tradition allowed the recipient to address the assembly. Kai stood behind the podium, and he looked out at the room, and for a long moment he said nothing. He looked at the admirals who had come to see the curiosity, the spectacle, the strange. Little Deathworlder who had broken their test. He looked at the ambassadors who were already calculating what this meant for their species' standing in the Concordance hierarchy. He looked at the instructors who had trained him and doubted him and watched him and were now reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the galaxy's newest member species. And then he looked at the trainees, his cohort, the ones who had gone into the simulation with him and been broken by it. Rael Tonvari sitting stiff and proud, with his golden fur groomed to perfection, and his amber eyes burning with something that was not quite anger and not quite shame. Jeek, with his cracked stone skin, and his gentle eyes, watching Kai with the patience of mountains. The Veltran and the Crothii and the dozens of other species who had spent 14 months training beside a human they had dismissed as unremarkable. Kai looked at all of them, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and simple, and he used small words because the truth does not need big ones. "I did not beat that simulation because humans are stronger than you," he said. "Most of you can break me in half with one hand, and some of you do not even need the hand." A small ripple of surprise moved through the room, because this was not how victory speeches usually started. "I did not beat it because humans are faster, or tougher, or smarter than you, because we are not, and I will not stand here and pretend otherwise." He gripped the edges of the podium. "I beat it because my species spent 200,000 years on a world that never stopped trying to kill us, and we never once accepted that as a reason to stop trying to live." The room was very quiet now. "Your worlds are dangerous," Kai said. "I have read the files, and I have seen the data, and I respect what your species have survived, because all of you come from places that would kill a careless. But your worlds have safe zones and migration paths and seasonal patterns that allow your species to retreat when things get bad, and regroup and come back when conditions improve. Earth does not have that. He let the words settle. On Earth there is no safe zone, because the entire planet is the danger, and there is nowhere to retreat to because every direction is another way to die. Freezing cold in the north, burning heat in the south, and hurricanes on the coasts, and earthquakes under the ground, and volcanoes that bury entire regions in ash, and diseases that killed half our population more than once. We could not leave because we did not have the technology, and we could not hide because there was nowhere to hide, and we could not wait for it to get better because it never got better. So we learned the one lesson that a death world teaches you when it is the only world you have. He looked directly at Rael when he said it. Next part. You do not get to leave, and you do not get to quit, and you do not get to decide that the odds are too bad and the situation is too hopeless, and therefore you are allowed to stop. You adapt or you die, and if adapting is not enough, you adapt again, and if that is not enough, you adapt again, and you keep adapting and keep fighting and keep building until either you win or the thing that is trying to kill you gets tired. And here is the secret about humans. He paused, and the silence was so complete that the hum of the station's power core was audible through the walls. We do not get tired, not of trying and not of fighting, and not of refusing to accept that something is impossible just because everything says it should be. Round 2 was not about proving that I am better than any of you, because I am not. It was about showing you what becomes possible when giving up is not something you know how to do. The podium, and that was all he said, because he was a human, and humans at their best say exactly what needs to be said, and nothing more. The silence held for 3 heartbeats. Then Shiik stood up. The massive Gorvan rose to his full 7 feet, and he brought his fist to his chest in the salute of his people, which was reserved for warriors who had earned the respect of stone itself. Then Rael stood. The golden Felinari rose, and he did not snarl, and he did not challenge, and he did not posture. He simply stood at attention and dipped his head in the Felinari gesture of acknowledged supremacy, which was a thing he had never done for anyone in his entire life. One by one the cohort rose, 200 trainees from 90 species standing in silence for the smallest and softest creature in the room. After the ceremony, Rael found Kai in the corridor. The Felinari stood in front of the human, and he looked like he was fighting a battle inside himself. That was harder than anything the simulation had thrown at him. Then he extended his hand. It was clumsy, because Felinari paws were not designed for human handshakes, and he had clearly been practicing the gesture in private, and it was the most awkward and sincere thing Kai had ever seen. "Teach me," Rael said. Kai took his hand and shook it, and said, "Yeah, okay." Zeke was next. "I am requesting a formal transfer to serve in whatever unit you are assigned to," the Gorvan said. "Why?" Kai asked. Zeke looked down at him with those gentle, ancient eyes. "Because you are small and soft and breakable, and you frighten me more than anything in that simulation, and I want to understand why." In the days that followed, several things happened quietly. Commandant Thax submitted a classified report to Concordance High Command, recommending that humans be fast-tracked into leadership and training roles across the entire fleet. They were the strongest species, but because they were the most relentless, and because relentlessness, it turned out, was the one quality that could not be trained into a species that had not evolved with it. Drill instructor Kesari designed a new training module for the Academy curriculum, and she called it Deathworld Thinking, Persistence Doctrine, and Adaptive Refusal. And its first guest lecturer was a quiet human with a strange smile, who had broken the unbreakable test by refusing to believe it was unbreakable. The Concordance Galactic Classification Board held a closed session and voted to amend their records, and when the new file was published, Earth was no longer listed simply as Deathworld 7. It was listed as Deathworld 7/Strategic Asset. Nobody explained what that meant. Nobody needed to. 6 months later, Sergeant Kai Nakamura led a mixed-species squad on their first real deployment in a contested sector at the edge of Concordance space. The mission went sideways in the first hour, and by the third hour, they were pinned behind the wreckage of their transport, with hostile fire coming from 3 directions, and no extraction available for 12 hours. Rail crouched beside Kai, with his fur standing on end and his claws out, and his amber eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from realizing that this time it is real, and there is no simulation pod to pull you out. Zeke knelt on the other side, with his stone skin already chipped from shrapnel, and his massive hands gripping a weapon that looked like a toy in his fists. The rest of the squad looked at their sergeant with the expression that soldiers have worn since the beginning of war. On every world, in every system, which is the expression that says, "Tell us what to do, because we do not know how to survive this." Kai checked his weapon and looked at the impossible odds, and grinned. "All right," he said. "Round 2. Somewhere in the vast, uncaring darkness of space, a little blue and green planet continued to spin around an ordinary yellow star, completely unaware that it had done something extraordinary. It had not built the strongest species in the galaxy, or the fastest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. It had built the one that would not quit, and that, as it turned out, was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.